Welcome to episode 7 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who lived in the age of Julius Caesar and who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you line by line through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. Before we start with today's episode, let me remind you of our 3 ground rules. First, our aim is to bring you an accurate presentation of classical Epicurean philosophy as the ancient Epicureans understood it, not to put our own positions into Lucretius's or Epicurus's words. Second, in this podcast we won't be talking about modern political issues. Over at the EpicureanFriends.com web forum, we call this approach not Neo-Epicurean, but Epicurean. Epicurean philosophy is not a religion. It's not Stoicism, humanism, libertarianism, atheism, or Marxism. It's its own unique philosophy, to be understood on its own terms, and not in terms of conventional modern morality. Third, Lucretius will show that Epicurus was not focused on over-the-top luxury, as some people say, but neither did he teach a minimalist lifestyle, as other people say. Epicurus taught that feeling, pleasure, and pain are the guides that nature gave us to live by, not gods, idealism, or virtue ethics. More than anything else, Epicurus taught us that the universe is not supernatural in any way, and that means there's no life after death, and any happiness we'll ever have comes in this life, which is why it is so important not to waste time in confusion. Remember that our homepage is lucretiustoday.com, and there you'll find a free copy of the version of the poem from which we're reading, and links to where you can discuss the poem between episodes at epicureanfriends.com. Now that we're up to date, let's start today's discussion with Martin reading the text from approximately line 175 of the Latin edition.
Why do we see the rose adorn the spring, the fruit in summer, and the sweety autumn pressing the wine, unless the fixed seeds of things, uniting in their proper times, give life to beings, each in its stated season, while Mother Earth can trust her tender offspring with safety to the air? But if things proceed from nothing, in a moment there might spring at times uncertain, at quarters of the year unfit, and there would be no proper seeds, whose kindly influence might check their growth at seasons that would kill them in the bud. Again, if things could spring from naught, what need of time for bodies to fulfill their growth by accession of new matter? An infant then might instantly become a youth, and trees start up in full perfection from the earth. But 'tis not so, 'tis plain, for things we know grow by degrees from certain seeds, and still, as they grow, keep their kind. And thus you find each being rise into bulk and thrives from seed and matter proper to itself. Nor likewise can the earth produce her fruits to cheer the heart, unless with timely showers impregnated. Nor can creatures blessed with life, deprived of food, ever propagate their kind or save their own lives. And so you say that certain fixed principles belong to certain things, as letters form our words, then that from nothing anything can rise. Further, whence is it that nature cannot shew men so gigantic as on foot, to wade through seas, or with their hands to tear up mighty hills, or to surpass the common bounds of life by many ages, but that certain seeds are fixed to all things, whence they must arise. And so we must confess that nothing springs from nothing, since each kind must proceed from seed, the principle whence every creature derives its life and feels the gentle air. Besides, we find the earth, improved by care, exceeds the uncultivated soil, and by turning up the fruitful clods, by ploughing and by breaking up the ground, we force to spring. But then, if no such seeds lay there, the fruits, without our labor, would of their own accord improve, and of themselves prevent our care.
If we go to each section here, there's a slightly different argument being made. So if we look at the first one, we're talking about seasons. Roses in the spring, fruits in the summer, grapes in the autumn. Why would you need seasons if things came out of nothing? You wouldn't have to have specific times of year that different things would grow if they weren't dependent on the other particles doing what they were doing.
To me, in terms of what you were saying about them being redundant or not, they are, as you say, focused on seasons and time issues, it seems like, because clearly the reference to the seasons in the beginning is talking about how the way crops and plants grow, and that they don't just pop into full adulthood from nothing. And then so the first series of sentences are really focused on how the natural chain of events is for plants and presumably animals to grow at a certain rate as opposed to all at once.
Well, but during this suitable season for this first section here, so there would be no proper seeds whose kindly influence might check their growth at seasons that would kill them in the bud. So roses trying to bloom in the middle of the winter, which those things happen in Alabama because of our erratic weather patterns and warm spells. We sometimes do get things budding and blooming out of season, and we get a cold, hard freeze and it kills them. So we'll lose our camellia bushes and so on periodically. So it does happen. So you can see by the times that it happens that it doesn't go well. So the usual course of events is for plants to have evolved so that the seeds germinate at the right times, because the other ones would usually be killed off.
We have the opposite problem sometimes, so that if autumn is too mild, then the bushes don't throw their leaves, and then they dry out in winter and die. No?
Right. So, but none of these things are happening independently. The weather affects the germination, the growth, the survival of the plant. They're not just free floating out there as they would be if things could come from nothing, and if the particles weren't interacting with each other, they could just grow anytime they wanted. It wouldn't matter. I think that's a good argument. I don't know if there's anything else to add to that section.
I see a couple of things of what we're reading from today that I carried over, it seems to me, in several other passages. There's the phrase about as letters form our words. And I think that's an analogy that's used several times about how the atoms coming together to form so many different things are similar to how you can have the letters of the alphabet being used in so many different words to form so many different concepts.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I didn't mean there was nothing else to say about the whole section. I mean that first paragraph. I think each section is, right, like we'll go to the next paragraph, is slightly different. I think what he's doing is it's an overdetermined answer. Everywhere you look, you can find evidence that what he's saying is the most likely truth because of the multiple different demonstrations of it. So there's a specific reason for each part of this, which I think is fascinating, the amount of time he spent into taking it apart. So this thing, if things could spring for naught, what need of time for bodies to fulfill their growth by accession of new matter? So then he starts talking about the developmental process, the difference between an infant and a youth, and the seed and the seedlings and the trees. There's actually a developmental process where it's not just a size progression, but a development. And if you could just come from nothing, you could just go to the fully developed adult form of your organism. You wouldn't have to go through developmental stages.
Maybe the way to summarize that would be to read the Bailey version to show it being stated in slightly different words.
Okay,
Elaine,
let's see.
would you do that?
Sure. Nay more, there would be no need for lapse of time for the increase of things upon the meeting of the seed if they could grow from nothing. For little children would grow suddenly to youths, and at once trees would come forth, leaping from the earth. But of this it is well seen that nothing comes to pass, since all things grow slowly, as is natural, from a fixed seed, and as they grow, preserve their kind, so that you can know that each thing grows great and is fostered out of its own substance. So there's a difference between an infant and a youth, not just size, but there's still a continuity of form. So even though I'll say this, I don't know if he was quite saying this, but I think it follows. Even though this particular atoms that are making up our bodies are turning over, changing out over time, the structures that they're in, the DNA and so on, are not changing out every time that the components are changing out. They're keeping their form. He does say that they keep their kind. So it's not just a poof, you change from one thing into another. It's a gradual process where the form is preserved. There's a lot in that.
That reminds me of the limits and boundaries discussion at the very beginning of the poem. And in fact, limits is probably a word that goes along with what we're talking about. We're talking about continuation within sort of guide rails, or continuation within limits. I guess that's what continuation means, is that you are moving and changing somewhat, but without changing your essential characteristics, or certain essential characteristics anyway.
Yeah, okay. And so Stallings says, from a certain seed, preserving their own species as they go, so each thing needs its own kind of material to grow. So that point is also in here, that its own kind of material I would take as, its own DNA, probably mitochondria, all those kind of things. You're not going to just suddenly turn into a bird, either.
Yes, the food aspect of it, that things need not only their own seeds, but their own type of food to sustain themselves, seems to go along with this. Right.
Yeah. And that wouldn't be the case if things could come from nothing. You wouldn't require you wouldn't require food, probably. You would be a breatharian. Have you heard of the breatharians?
No, what's that?
I think it's a bunch of people who say that they're so spiritually pure that they can live on air, but then secretly go and binge in their houses when nobody's looking. Yeah, that's my impression.
There are Indian, I think, yogis or what that are, who claim that as well, that they can go for food for several months.
Yeah. Some of these people say they never have to eat food again, that they have ascended to the level of just being able to get their nutrition out of the air. But you know that they're not fasting for years. They're eating secretly. What's funny is that people would believe them.
Yeah, one friend from India or Pakistan told me the reason for that is in India are many analphabets, and he said it's strange that the analphabets, apparently they believe almost everything.
I didn't understand that last part. Who would eat almost everything?
The analphabets, people who cannot read and write.
Oh, okay.
So then everything they hear, they take for, if it's not obviously a lie, they take it for the truth.
They need Lucretius. I guess the big thing, there are plenty of people who can read and write who don't read and write things that have accurate information in them. And the breatharian thing is a kind of a trendy new age thing, at least in the U.S. So they can read, they put their little blog posts up, but they haven't read information that's accurate. Which actually, do you want to comment one more thing on reading after a discussion that we had on Epicurean friends about doing things that are natural? That reading is not natural to humans, meaning that it's not innate. It is learned. There are not structures in the brain that are specifically appear to be evolved for reading yet. Maybe that will eventually happen, but it may be why we have more reading disorders than we do language disorders in general. But just because something is not innate doesn't mean that we won't experience it as a pleasure. That was a real aside, but when we talking about reading, I want to throw that in there. So let's see. Not likewise can the earth produce her fruits to cheer the heart unless with timely showers impregnated, nor can creatures blessed with life deprived of food ever propagate their kind or save their own lives. And that's where you get, and so you say that certain fixed principles belong to certain things as letters form our words, then that from nothing anything can arise. So this even more drives home the need for the food. That's just a continuation of that last.
Yes, I'm looking at the Bailey version of that, and it seems to me that by the time you get to that part of the passage, he's shifting from another list of observations to sort of giving you the conclusion. The part I'm looking at says, there is this too, that without fixed rain showers in the year, the earth could not put forth its gladdening produce, nor again held apart from food could the nature of living things renew its kind or preserve its life. And then Bailey has so, which indicates to me that we're moving to apply these observations. And what Bailey says is so, that rather you may think that many bodies are common to many things, as we see letters are to words, than that without first beginnings anything can come to being. So to me, what he's stressing in that last part is he's telling you why what he has just said over and over is important, because this observation of the way nature moves incrementally helps us understand that nature moves through the operation of the atoms, and that the atoms can themselves form so many different things and change in so many different ways, just as letters can be rearranged to form so many different words that mean so many different things. And that basically that's sort of the conclusion he's persuading us towards here, is that the atoms are the foundation of the changes and the things we see in the world, and that we need to understand that that's how the universe operates, and not entertain the idea that anything can happen without a first beginning seed, that anything can come into being on its own.
So that in the first paragraph that we've talked about today, the focus was on the seasons and the differences between the seasons, and that different organisms that are suited to different seasons don't tend to germinate and grow in the wrong season. And then we've got the section on the developmental differences, changing from an infant to a youth, but still maintaining the basic underlying form of the species. And then now we've got not just a dependent on seasons, but the organisms have all got to have water. The water being the letters, right, that are forming the words. The food being necessary to form the creatures, as another aspect of us not developing our own matter from nothing. So we might start small, but we still got to get more matter to get bigger. Where does it come from? We've got to have water and fuel. And so those are the letters that form the words of a certain plant or a certain species. And then that drives home the whole process of something coming from something, not nothing from nothing.
Well, I'm continuing to look at the Bailey version, which today strikes me as being a little bit easier to understand. And so there's two more passages or two more paragraphs that we were looking at today. Mm-hmm. Martin, are you able to look at the passage that's labeled 200 on the Bailey section and maybe read to the end of it?
Okay. Mm-hmm. Once more, why could not nature produce main so large that on their feet they might wade through the waters of ocean, or rend asunder mighty mountains with their hands, or live to overpass many generations of living men, if it be not because fixed substance has been appointed for the begetting of things, from which it is ordained what can arise? Therefore we must confess that nothing can be brought to being out of nothing, inasmuch as it needs a seed for things, from which each may be produced and brought forth into the gentle breezes of the air. Lastly, inasmuch as we see that tilled grounds are better than the untilled, and when worked by hands yield better produce, we must know that there are in the earth first beginning of things, which we call forth to birth by turning the teeming sods with the plowshare and drilling the soil of the earth. But if there were no such, you would see all things without toil of ours of their own will come to be far better.
Okay, what I would say in response to hearing that is that the last paragraph is kind of a continuation of what we've been reading today, but I see something slightly different in the section that says, once more, why could not nature produce men so large that on their feet they might wade through the waters of the ocean? Uh-huh. There he's suggesting, well, why can't nature do that? He's not really saying that nothing can come from nothing to do that. He is looking and saying that even nature seems to only limit itself to certain things.
Yeah, I mean, this is clearly the case from DNA. We're in a species, we only have a certain amount of variation. However, but we would call them another species. I mean, there could arise mutants, some kind of giant group of creatures that came from humans, but they wouldn't be. They didn't really understand that at the point where he wrote this. But what I see in this, the point that he's making that's a little different, is he's talked about why we couldn't just spring into being, all of a sudden, that we grow from babies, we require fuel. He's talked about trees not producing, like an apple tree not making a pear. So in this, he's talking about variation within a species. Why isn't it dramatic unless that species has some kind of limit on what makes it a species, and it comes from the starting material, from the seed, and that's true. And it is that slightly different angle.
Yeah, the limit that what makes it a species does not come from the Word of God, or it doesn't come from an ideal apple tree that exists somewhere in another dimension. It comes from the nature of the atoms that have combined to form apple trees.
Right. So, and talking about variation within a species rather than just one, imagining one species turning into another one or coming out of nothing. This is a different angle, and he's really picked it apart very well. So the last paragraph I actually think is different too. You think that's more of just a continuation?
Tell me what you see. I could have possibly just flipped it into the middle of the discussion we've had already, but what do you see there?
Okay, so we'll hear where he says tilled grounds are better than the untilled, and when worked by hands yield better produce. That if farming didn't make things better, I mean, you could just, for the humans, more suitable for the humans that are trying to grow them, we wouldn't be doing it. So he's talking to people who agricultural. He's not in the hunter-gatherer age. He's talking to agriculturalists or at least who eat the food that agriculturists have grown. And so he's appealing to their knowledge that you're changing things by tilling them, by farming, by selecting the produce that you want and collecting those seeds. You're changing what happens. You wouldn't need to do that if that would just happen out of nothing. Your actions are producing what's happening.
Okay, I see what you're saying, and it does in several different ways. The one that I'm hearing you say first is that he's appealing to a particular group of listeners who are going to be familiar with something more specialized rather than just how the seasons change every year, which presumably pretty much everybody understands how the seasons change every year. But I would presume that many of the readers or listeners of the poem would have been agricultural in that time period, and they would be spending a lot of their time actually tilling the ground and farming themselves.
Yeah.
And it would probably hit home to them. Think about how much of your time that you spend every day is based on this presumption that nature has a system behind it that arises from these atoms. That's what you base everything you do on every day, and farming is cooperating with the workings of the atoms in nature.
Yeah.
If you could get food to appear on your shelf without, from nothing, then you'd be better off going to the local temple and learning the incantations to cause food to just poof out of the air from nothing, but you are not able to do that.
Yes.
Without toil of hours of their own will could be done far better.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just not possible. It does take our toil to farm successfully.
Martin?
Yeah, I have nothing to add now.
Elaine, I recall a comment you made a few minutes ago in regard to the limits of how big something could grow to be and so forth. I do think as we go further on, maybe even pretty soon in this book, it may be in book 2 or 3, I think Lucretius does return time and again to the issue of how some combinations are possible, but others are not. Like centaurs, I believe, is a specific reference I remember reading about. He makes the point that some combinations of living things can occur, but others would not, and that over the ages, nature has probably tried huge numbers of combinations, only some of which can successfully sustain their kind. So there's a lot of further discussion of the issues that are being started in these sections as the book goes on.
Yeah.
With the overall context continuing to be that it is important for your happiness and your understanding of human nature to realize that you're not a plaything of supernatural gods who are constantly shaking up the world around you and causing things to happen from nothing. And so therefore it's necessary for your happiness to learn how nature really operates so that, as in this example, you can toil the ground in a successful way. You can work with nature to produce happiness as opposed to just cowering in a cave wondering what God is going to do to you next. Or spending your time hopelessly paralyzed in fear that whether it's gods or not, anything could happen at any moment. The ground you walk on might just disappear into nothing at any moment. Now, of course, disappearing into nothing is going to be the subject of the next section, because what we've been talking about so far is things not coming from nothing, but then we're going to go very shortly into the issue that things don't go to nothing or turn to nothing either. I guess we haven't hit that yet in the chain of reasoning here.
Yeah.
That will be coming up shortly. The bottom line being that if you use your senses and your common sense to intelligently observe and draw conclusions from the evidence of the senses, you can gain a certain level of control over your circumstances and build houses and farm and raise crops and animals and create a scheme of life that will allow you to live much more happily than you would otherwise. And it's possible to do that because of the system of nature, which is based on the movement of atoms and the nature of the atoms themselves.
And no, we're not talking modern politics, but I would, and you can cut this out if you don't think it goes, but I think given the recent developments with the coronavirus, if nobody had ever gotten to the point where they understood nothing comes from nothing, meaning something comes from something, and then trying to figure out what that something is, we wouldn't be at the point where researchers can so quickly look at that something in detail and try to come up with a vaccine for it. And so we've still got people out there who are saying various viruses and whatnot are punishments for certain groups of people. But fortunately, we also have people who realize that something comes from something, and then what is that something, and then what can we do about it? And the process of researching to make vaccines has gotten, it just amazes me as a physician to see how quickly they came up with an Ebola vaccine. And how quickly that this new COVID-19 vaccine is in development. It will take quite a while for it to come to the office where you can go get your shot. But just being able to that quickly understand the components to be able to get a vaccine is amazing. And we couldn't do things like that unless we understood these ideas that are in this one.
Otherwise, we'd be sitting around praying about the problem or doing all sorts of other incantations or incense or other things that just would have no effect on it whatsoever.
Exactly. We'd be saying maybe they were possessed. They had demons in them or something.
That's right. It's not straying too far into politics to be talking about the coronavirus and things like that. Of course, somebody might want to say, well, it's civilization itself that has caused the coronavirus. If you had not done all these things to produce technology and civilization, then we wouldn't have a coronavirus. But that's just the same kind of.
Where did they get that? It started in fairly primitive in the wet market. So that's the way humans have always done things, and we've gotten diseases from animals. Where do they think the plague came from? That's funny.
Yeah, that's the basic point. I was trying to hypothesize that, or I was trying to basically say that even if we do occasionally, because of our technology, we do end up causing our own problems, we also, because of our technology and civilization, have the ability to solve our problems as well. If we took the alternative approach of just living as minimally and as simply and as, what's the word for living in a caveman style of environment?
Paleo?
Subsist. Yes. Yeah. If we had never, if civilization had never progressed past the hunter-gatherer stage, there's certainly problems that we have today that we would never have experienced. But also would never have experienced so many of the good things that have occurred because of civilization. And because of civilization and technology, we have the ability to solve the problems that we ourselves create.
Well, we sure wouldn't be able to be talking to each other right now about Lucretius' poem.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. As we go into more and more of these details, I think the important thing is going to be to continue relating them, to continue stating why we're talking about them. This is where we miss Charles. We'd be talking about Lemaitre or some Middle Ages artwork.
I can't think of a new musical that would apply here. Or a Disney movie.
I was quite impressed with the reference to The Sound of Music, because I guess I had just haven't watched it in so long. I had not appreciated the Nothing from Nothing song. Anything more generally today to say about it that we could blend into this conversation? I
would say that what he's doing here, as in the last section, is also he's making direct observations about what happens and what he has not seen happening, which is essential part of the Epicurean canon of truth, how you know what's real, through observations of the senses. So all of these ways that plant life and animal life behaves, he is able to pick apart this way and describe because he's made observations. So maybe we'll just emphasize the importance of that, continuing to make observations, not stopping with observations that have already been made, but continue to make your own observations and then test ideas that you've been given against what you observe. Does that really make sense? That if you are listening right now and you believe in a supernatural being, really think about whether that squares with what you're observing to happen in reality.
I completely agree with what you say. And another aspect of it may be that we're going through the basic building blocks of his reasoning about the nature of the universe without ever saying, well, Epicurus said this, that, or the other, or Democritus said this, that, or the other, or Plato said this, that, or the other, or looking to a mathematical formula, or looking to an idea or a religion, really. He's looking straight out at common, ordinary, natural events that all of us can observe of our own abilities.
Yeah.
And he's drawing conclusions starting at a level at which you have a strong ability to verify what he's saying. It's not just, he's definitely using deductive logic. He's not at all going in the direction of saying that reason is not important or that logic is not important. He's using a certain type of logic and reason tied just very closely to common sense, immediate, verifiable observations.
Yeah.
Not read XYZ book and then read MNP book. Observing nature is where we're going to get the answers to our problems and to our questions. It's not going to be from religion or from pure speculation.
Right.
Martin, I bet you have something on that point about how important it is to tie our reasoning to verifiable observation. That's something I consider to be a very German characteristic of being very matter of fact or very practical or scientific in a certain way.
Yeah, this is what I mean. It's rather science. No, this is the cornerstone of science, because German actually in German culture we have a lot of mysticism. So which is then rather different from that. I think this is somehow a concept what's in America, that they think Germans are scientific. I don't think so. They are mystics, maybe the majority of them.
I think of German engineering when I think of cars and so forth.
Yeah, okay. That somehow fits, but you have excellent engineering in almost all major countries. So that one is. I don't think that Germany is nowadays anyway apart from this. In the 19th century, Germany had an edge and gradually lost it in the first half of the 20th century. And I don't see significant advantage on that one, or significant difference.
There's definitely a difference here. I'm no expert on Nietzsche or other German philosophers, but I don't really read in my understanding of German philosophers a lot of discussion of rain showers and the seasons of the year and things like that. It seems to be, in philosophy in general, it's much more theoretical than it is. Let's start with how chickens grow from eggs over time. They don't really do anything like that.
Yeah, that one I can confirm. I mean, that put me off from philosophy quite a while when I was young, because I found it just theoretical nonsense. So I grabbed the wrong ones, Hegel and a few others like that, and no, that's not my thing. No?
That's a direction we could take this for a couple of minutes. People need an understanding of the way the world works. They need a philosophy, but it's proper to be turned off by so much of the philosophy that's out there today because it's also theoretical and divorced from everyday experience. Elaine, I bet you have something on that. Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, go ahead, Martin.
It's like what I think I read it from the Popper, so that Plato sent philosophy completely in the wrong direction.
Who sent philosophy in the wrong direction? Plato?
Plato, yes.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's another statement that basically Plato founded philosophy, and everything after him is just footnotes to Plato, no?
Right.
But, I mean, this is of course then not of much help if it's the wrong direction.
And it's the wrong direction in what way or why?
Yeah, because it's divorced from reality, largely. I mean, it's a bit motivated, at least in some ways, but then it goes completely the wrong way. So that his ideas are more real than reality, and this is complete nonsense to start with.
Right. I mean, in my field in medicine, whenever the idea thinking gets ahead of actual observations, we get into trouble. So we get into even simple stuff like, there's this thing that doctors tell patients, push fluids when they have a cold. It's based on nothing. It's based on other people telling them that. There's no evidence that pushing fluids helps a cold. And if for more severe respiratory infections like flu, there's some evidence, at least in children, that being too aggressive with fluids might hurt you in some cases, but certainly doesn't do anything. You don't want to be dehydrated significantly. I mean, that's true. We know being dehydrated can be dangerous, but drinking a lot extra when you're sick, there's really no basis in observation for that. So when you're doing medical observations, of course, you have to be careful that you're not fooling yourself with a limited data set. You got to look at a lot of them and make sure you're not getting confounding factors, and it can be more complicated. But it's still ultimately observations. So there's a whole lot in medicine that people are just repeating because they got told it from somebody else, and they never bothered to actually look and see what happens or whether somebody else has actually studied it. So it's not a problem that has gone away. It stays with us.
People want to know what's going to make them well. They're not really interested in hearing a academic lecture on the nature of disease and the nature of mechanisms and what could possibly be there. They really want the practical advice of what to do and what not to do.
They do, and when the practical advice doesn't mean anything, people keep using it. Even the people who know that it doesn't mean anything say it because they want to say something. They don't want to say, well, you're going to get better or you won't. You're just going to have to, your immune system's going to have to deal with it, which is most of the time what is the case. So they just make stuff up and nobody thinks about it. It fascinates me.
Going back to the Plato aspect that Martin was commenting on, the analogy that I've heard said over and over is that Plato refused to trust the senses. And so the result of the Platonic method is that you can see an animal with 4 legs and a long tail and a mane in front of you, but you can never really be sure exactly what that thing is because you can't trust your senses. But in the world or the realm of ideal forms, a horse exists, and you can absolutely be certain about what horse means in the realm of ideal forms, but as to whether the particular animal in front of you is a horse, you can never know. And that just turns everything on its head in terms of the practical ability to live your life.
That's crazy. If you really thought about that and then made your own observations, you would know that was just not anything to it.
But the other opposite approach is what we're seeing these passages, and the ones that are going to follow are
to actually look around Lucretius, you and see what's happening. Yeah.
Yes. And reach your conclusions based on what's happening to you, around you, in your world.
Yeah.
As opposed to what some theory of someone can come up with might mean. Which is just so very different than the way most people live their lives. We live our lives under the influence of religion. And I say religion, we can be very specific about the issue of life after death. So much of what we do and the way we organize our lives is based on, well, how long are we going to live? Am I going to do things today in order to guarantee that I exist in eternity in heaven? Or am I living my life with the knowledge that this is the only life I've got? And when hard decisions have to be made, people tend to default in many instances to standards of judgment and standards of the way to live that have very little practical verification behind them. Okay, I can take what we've done today and make something pretty good out of it.
Yeah, I think so.
Anything else before we wrap up today? Martin, anything else?
Not from me, no.
I think that's it. All right. I'll talk to y'all next week.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Next week. Bye.